Okay, it is now 1:45, and so I resume the hearing. If I could ask everyone to take a seat, please, preferably their own. Okay, just before the break, then, Mr. Hargreaves, you were making some comments about Part B of Policy H5 as proposed to be amended by the Council. Yeah, I'm going to do something I don't often do, just for the hell of it, really, and that is to anticipate what Mr. Henderson might say in response to your comments. And it might be, I don't know, let's see, that Mr. Henderson might say, well, if we look at paragraph 10 of the planning policy for traveller sites, that tells us what we need to do in our local plan. The first of those things is to identify, etc., a supply of specific deliverable sites to provide 5 years' worth of sites against the locally set targets. And what Mr. Henderson might say on that is, well, he'll say no doubt first of all, well, we've done that. We are providing the pitches that are needed for years 1 to 5. He might even say, well, even if you are right in part, Mr. Hargreaves, we don't need to provide the 10 that we are. In order to meet that part of the policy, we only need to provide 9. Then looking at, as you were, Part B of the policy, that is to be tested against paragraph 10B of the PPTS, which says identify a supply of specific developable sites or broad locations for growth for years 6 to 10 and, where possible, for years 11 to 15. And what Mr. Henderson might say about that is that that is precisely what the policy is doing, because it is identifying through provision on the strategic, well, not necessarily the strategic sites, on the sites which are caught by the various thresholds, if I can put it that way. The plan is providing for the sites that paragraph 10B anticipates. So in short, what is your response to that potential reply that Mr. Henderson might give?
Hang on. Okay. First, sorry. Well, firstly, because the council has, as it were, is in the process of artificially restricting the supply of sites through imposing a very rigid green belt, it will not be possible to identify, or it will be extremely difficult to identify the sites for the years 6 to 10 and 11 to 15. And secondly, to repeat my point, which, I hope is very strong, is that developers will not go along with H5B. It simply will not happen within sight, and by putting in place a rigid green belt, you're making it extremely difficult to identify other land in their control.
It wouldn't, though, be a question of not being too chuffed about going along with it, though, would it? It would be a question of, well, you go along with it or you don't get planning permission unless you can prove that the requirement would render your site unviable. So I think what you're suggesting is that that is what developers would do.
I think they are, I mean, I'm not, I'm not a barrister, a lawyer, but I think it is very likely that they will play the para 122 CIL regs card.
Because, in what way? Saying that it's not fairly and reasonably related to the development in question.
Yeah.
That would be there in the context of the proposed policy being an adopted policy.
Yeah, now I agree that the proposed policy being adopted gives it a measure of weight, but we...
Well, it gives it development plan status, doesn't it?
Yeah, but on an individual...
The development plan policy against which a proposal must be determined unless
against, in the light of other material considerations. Yeah.
I think in a very oblique way, perhaps, is that you are suggesting that I need to take into account what the CIL regulations say in my assessment.
Yes. I think that is the case.
And that's a question of the effectiveness of the policy.
Yeah. And I think, I would emphasise you've got to read this with the green belt. There isn't an option. There isn't another land option available to developers. I mean, I talked about...
Yeah, if it helps, I completely understand the point that you're making about the green belt boundaries, as you say, as you characterise them being tightly drawn and what that means in terms of alternative land.
I mean, just to complete that, sir, one case that I had some direct involvement in where a developer developing a major urban extension on one side of a town which had green belt on the other side, right, did agree to offer a piece of land in the non-green belt area, and he was able to do that because they owned a big chunk of the land on one side of that city. Right? And the land, in the end, it wasn't achievable for some other reasons because they went for a piece of, but they offered the land precisely because it was over half a mile from the nearest private housing they were seeking to sell. And so that's a particular, that helps me get in the head of the developer looking at this. If I've got other land nearby or relatively a little away, I might be willing to offer that to get out of the H5, to sort of square the H5B circle. But I can't do that because of the green belt.
You're sitting very quietly, Mr. Jones. I wonder if this is a point on which you had something to say.
No, I don't think it is.
Okay. Mr. Pittam?
Yeah, I'd just like to make this point again in terms of saying when I turned up to the ST7 inquiry, we wanted the opportunity to ask the developers what they thought about this. And of course, that wasn't going to be possible. But it is interesting for me that they're not here today. And that is part of the reason why I think they feel that this isn't going to be workable in the long run. And I think we would agree with them on that.
Well, look at that. Mr. Jones does want to say something now. Mr. Jones.
I hadn't expected to say anything. So I think the only thing I would say is that we set out in our statement on this matter that the workings of the policy, I think, in terms of the requirement to make provision on strategic sites is not without difficulty. And I support some of the comments that have been made this morning in that respect. But there is provision within that policy for off-site contributions where those difficulties give rise, as I understand it, mean that on-site provision cannot be made, and therefore, I think in our statements we've said that those off-site contributions, may be the way in which that policy is best worked. I think that's all I really can add at this stage.
And if I might just add to that, we were approached by a developer when the first iteration of this plan went, and who said to us, well, what do you need? What do you think the travellers actually need? But I think that would have been within a green belt constraint. So, and of course, since that, the green belt legislation has tightened. So we feel that we are in a really difficult place in relation to this. But we would be very, very open to be discussing with any of the developers how we might move forward in terms of providing alternative provision.
Yeah, one point I need to follow up with you, Mr. Henderson, because I didn't quite understand the point that was being made, and I want to make sure that I do before I leave the room today. And that was the point about the council's wider land portfolio, and I wasn't quite sure how this played into the supply point.
I'm very pleased that you've picked up on that, sir, because that was on my list to clarify for you. So the short point is that that is not within the policy. You will note that the policy does not say the council will look at its wider land estate. The reason being we've looked for the purpose of site selection and at present have not identified an available suitable site. But the reason why we've given you that evidence this morning is to explain one of the purposes to which the contributions can be put. And given we are looking at that, as you've very correctly highlighted, developable time frame, 6 years plus, we would expect in that time frame for operational requirements to change and for land availability to change within the council's estate, which may allow alternative sites to be developed by the council in the way that Mr. Jones has described. So it's not part of the policy, and I don't need to rely upon it for soundness of that policy, but it's to explain to you some of the evidence that perhaps the inspector at the ST2 appeal didn't have before her. So that's that point. If that's sufficient clarity, I'll move on to the other points. So you correctly, sir, with respect, anticipated where I was going to go. Deliverability.
Incorrectly, did you say?
No, correctly. Deliverability, para 10A. Do we have a supply for 5 years? Yes, we do. See Part A of the policy. Mr. Hargreaves says 8 pictures on a sort of broad brush analysis on his feet. I don't mean that disrespectfully, but that's what it was. We only need 9. And I say we have 9 through the more indicative work that Mr. Jones has done. He's actually measured the area. He's looked at what is available there. So my submission, paragraph 10A, satisfied. That then leaves 10B, developable sites, and part B of the policy. It's not clear to me whether the Travellers Trust say this is or isn't sound, or what modification they want to make to it, but I will deal with the points that they raise. The first point is it said, well, what I'm going to call the negotiation point is too difficult. The short answer here, sir, is no, it's not. This will be a policy requirement of these sites that will need to be satisfied in order to obtain planning permission. It will have the force of statute by virtue of section 38(6). If developers seriously thought they were not going to satisfy that policy as part of delivering their sites, they would have told this examination, and they haven't. They would all be here today saying, if you let this policy go through, our sites will not come forward. Not one person has done that. Because, being realistic, this can be made to work. Yes, there might be challenges, but that's because we need to impose this requirement to deal with the situation in York. At the same time, I can deal with the Reg 122 point. We need to remember what Reg 122 is all about. It is a prohibition on taking a matter into account as a reason for granting planning permission when it's contained in an obligation. It does not modify and cannot modify section 38(6), the requirement to comply with the development plan. More to the point, it's in my submission inappropriate to speculate about how that may be applied in any future application. We are dealing here with plan making, and we have explained through our evidence how, in principle, each limb of 122 can be satisfied. But we could quite easily require this provision by way of a condition and avoid 122 altogether, because it only applies to planning obligations. So that in my submission is an argument that goes nowhere and doesn't grapple with or undermine the central point, which is this will be a policy requirement to be complied with. Mr. Porter's evidence on viability has taken this into account, so that is not going to be another material consideration that will be put against the non-delivery of those pictures. Then we get the general point about the constraints of the greenbelt. What's being omitted here is two things. Firstly, that developers of these strategic sites do not need to go out and find other land. On-site provision is the preference. Secondly, if they do want to go out and find other land, it is likely that they will be able to do so. You have heard at great length the windfall supply from year 3 onwards. Those windfall sites are not ones, or certainly the vast majority, are not ones which we anticipate would be in the greenbelt. So if they do
specifically won't be, probably.
I think will not is probably better. So yes. So we've already identified, and you've examined at great length, that component of supply. So to say simply there won't be any other land is directly contrary to all of that evidence which you've already heard and has been tested. That then leaves finally what I'm going to say is the generalised ambition from the Travellers' Trust to have allocations. We are allocating a site in policy H6, we can come to that perhaps in a moment. We are not allocating sites in policy H5 because, as I've said at the outset, we've done the assessment. We do not have available sites which are unconstrained and can be allocated. No omission site has been put forward by the Travellers' Trust or anybody else. Nobody has said, you've missed a site. Here it is, this is the landowner writing into the examination to say, my land's available, and this is the assessment to show it's unconstrained. There's no contrary evidence on that. So in those circumstances, we need to look for an alternative approach, and that is what you have before you. There's no other modification proposed to that approach. In my submission, it is sound. I can deal finally with the minor point about PPTS paragraph 4E, simply for completeness. This is about private and public sites. You will, of course, have read the start of paragraph 4 carefully. You'll note that that is simply a government ambition to promote more private traveller sites. It is expressed as a government aim. It is not a requirement that needs to be complied with in order for this plan to be sound. More to the point, there are good reasons, given the historic character of the community in York, to deliver further public sites. And there is no prohibition on private traveller sites coming forward. Indeed, those sites on the strategic sites could well be dealt with as private sites. There's no reason why they could not be essentially service plots sold on a private treaty basis to a traveller household. Equally, if a travelling family, a household, identify land which they wish to develop as a private site, they're able to do so under Part C of the policy. So there is total accord with paragraph 4E, even if you were to read it in what I submit is an unduly restrictive approach. So I think they were all the principal points by the Travellers' Trust this morning.
Mr. Hargreaves.
Thank you, sir. A couple of quick points. First, small one. In terms of the adequacy of the potential allocation, if we could call it that, at Clifton, being adequate for the first 5 years, well, clearly that depends on the numbers. If we're right that the overall level of need is significantly larger, you'll need more. Secondly, I think I'm not convinced by what Mr. Henderson is saying about the ability of windfall sites to meet the need. It's highly likely that any proposal for traveller sites within the non-Greenbelt footprint of the city would have a high value. There would be kind of a lot of aspiration to develop it. There would be a lot of competition for that land. If proposals, we all know that if within the, let's say, suburban areas of the built-up area of York, the development and a planning application was to come forward, or a proposal on behalf of the council, or agreed to by the council to develop a new traveller site, it would be strongly opposed. So it's not realistic. I don't know if I'm allowed to do this, but I'm interested to know, let's say, and it's hypothetical, sir, you agree with me that H5B is just completely unworkable and unrealistic. And let's say you agree with us that it's much more likely to be workable with allocations. Is it possible under the process, I can't get my head around this, to require such allocations so late in this local plan process?
Yes.
Follow on that, how would the council respond if it was required to identify a set of some sites, a couple of sites for formal allocations for gypsies and travellers which should not be in the green belt?
Yeah, to be clear, if I think that there is a soundness problem here and additional land were required to meet gypsy and traveller needs, then I would set that out to the council. I would not go about the business of choosing sites myself. As you rightly well, your question rightly suggested, I would hand that task to the council because this is, after all, its plan. How the council would react to that.
Sir, that's a matter for us if and in the event you make that question. So put that question to us.
I'm just wondering if I could just add to that. In our submission in 2018, you will notice that we asked the council, we asked them if they would start looking for sites, because we knew that it was going to be quite a challenging task. And, you know, I'm sure that you will observe, sir, that it's the position that Michael Jones has put forward today is that this post hasn't even yet been appointed. So, you know, again, there's a real problem here in terms of all of our communications. We've asked and asked and asked to be involved and that we would assist in this process. And we get to the point that we're here today at the inspection without even an appointment having been made to that position.
If you're wrong, Mr. Hargreaves, and H5B turns out to be effective in securing pitches on the sites that fall within, well, in effect, it's sites of 100 dwellings plus, isn't it? Did you want to say something about the suitability of that arrangement?
Thank you, sir. I think, well, I recall a conversation I had with master planners, local planners in East Hertfordshire in regard to exactly that kind of provision. I think, I was saying, we need to, you know, separate for them to be successful, and they probably need to have a degree of separation from the private housing, and that's likely to be welcomed as well by the private developers. But the problem was, and this was in the context of a much larger site, that the amount of land with the green buffer that we were suggesting would be necessary for the sites to be attractive to private traveller development would have really eaten into the master plan for that site. Now, I've read, and there's been quite a lot of criticism that some of the key sites on the fringes of the city are too small. You know, that they're not real garden villages. It's going to, you know, the council's been quite conservative with a small c in the size of the footprint of the allocations. That's going to make that more difficult.
B of the policy is aimed at delivering supply for Gypsy and traveller households. Oh, it's do and do not, isn't it? Yeah, because you have the difference between the overall identified need for those that do meet the definition and the 10 pitches that are provided through Part A. Those that do not meet the planning definition, can you just remind me of the number on that?
So yes, in your GTAA, I've just got rid of mine, hold on. I'm sorry, one moment, sir, I'll just pull it up.
In the current plan, I think it's 25.
Yeah, it's 14 that have need and 24 that don't. It's figure 1, page 8. But when you add in the undetermined, do we get to 25?
So on your figures
25 then, sir, sorry, when you add in the undetermined.
So 25 households.
Yes.
Yes, at the risk of Mr. Hargreaves getting angry at this question, I was wondering actually what the successful operation of policy H5B might look like in terms of the number of pitches it would actually yield. And I wonder if you potentially at some point hit a stage where you no longer need to apply that bit.
A question for Ms. Bartle, who, as of about 2 minutes ago, anticipated the question. I'm not sure we necessarily have the trajectory immediately in front. Here we go.
Or is it a matter for the required review of the plan on a 5-year basis?
Well, it would certainly be a matter for that, sir. It would be a matter for monitoring as well, to support that. But as we look at it today, I think Ms. Bartle might be able to help.
I would have been if I'd brought back from lunch my piece of paper that had it on, as I hadn't. If you bear with me a moment, I can go and retrieve it.
Okay, well, I'll put the same question to Mr. Hargreaves in the meantime.
I suppose my answer to that would be A, firstly, we've got to agree on a robust assessment of numbers, right? Which we would say needs to be greater, right? I would also say something I've wanted to say, that, I mean, in a way, the wording of in H5B modified of that do and do not meet is kind of introduces a confusion, right? I would strongly advocate, well, because you have to make assumptions about the unknown, because of the questions that have been asked about the soundness of the methodology, including when you're dependent on proxy interviews. Because we know some households will change which side of the fence they lie on through the life cycle. And that because the council also effectively, I know we're focusing on those that meet the definition, but the effect, the effect of the MPPF with the requirement to assess the needs of caravan dwellers and boat dwellers means the plan has to also show how it's going to provide for people who fall outside the definition. Now, in our submission, rather than attempting to differentiate between nomadic sheep and non-nomadic goats, a far more sensible approach, or safer approach, is the kind of approach which was supported by the Vale of Aylesbury local plan inspector, quoted at para 11 of our phase 2 matters 4 and 7 statement, which is, you know, let's make a common provision. And then there's the nuanced, different approach in the Guildford local plan, where all the allocations are for sites for gypsies and travellers sui generis. Now that policy was supported by the Guildford local plan inspector, and I would commend it to you, that instead of giving us extra hoops to go through about whether this site is for nomadic and this site is for nomadic and maybe non-nomadic, that we have common allocations and a common policy.
Ms Bartle.
So apologies again for that. I do have a figure of 33 dwellings. That takes out those sites that we know of that have planning permission that were not subject to this policy requirement. So they're those sites that would that currently have permission that are not part of.
Sorry, I didn't follow.
So you asked whether what figure or number of pitches would be generated from the application and operation of that policy. There are some sites in our supply that do have.
Yeah, sorry,
permission.
I think you said dwellings rather than
Did I say?
pitches.
Oh, apologies.
Yeah.
Sorry, pitches is what. Yes. So the figure that I've applied, which would take out those approved sites and therefore the contribution of pitches that would otherwise be made had this policy been in place. Yeah, is 33, yes.
That's 33 supply, sir. Can I just come back on this point about common provision very quickly? There's no need to alter the word in the policy. We need to meet definitional need. It's therefore appropriate that we refer to definitional need in the policy. Equally, so far as we are able to do so, meeting non-definitional need is consistent with national policy. I've given you the references earlier, and therefore referring to those who both do and do not meet the definition in the annex to PPTS is appropriate here. Just no modification required for soundness. So that then, I think, unless you want to come back on anything that I've just said, that leaves 4 quick points on what we heard beforehand. But, I mean, I'd rather the Travellers Trust finished. If there's more to say, I'd rather they finished, and then I'll do everything in one hit.
Thank you, sir. 2 points. One is, maybe I've misunderstood this, but it's only a sort of guess. The Laura Bartle's 33 is possibly only a guesstimate, a policy-driven guesstimate. If I'm right that the most of the success, in fact all of the success, my prediction, will be financial contributions, there will be lumps of money, and we don't know exactly how many pitches will be achieved through that. It might be more. I think it's quite likely to be less when we actually drill down to the real delivery costs. I think while I'm speaking, I'll just make another point about one's numbers. I just wonder whether if you apply H5B, the implication for the west of Elvington Lane site is too low. 6 pitches in association with 3,339 dwellings, which you could compare with, for instance, 4 required from 1348 dwellings in the west of Wigington Road site. So if it's a particularly large site, might it deliver more? Question mark, right? And taking that a bit further, given how large the west of Wigington, the west of Elvington Lane site is proposed, would it not be possible to include a specific within-site allocation for X pitches within that site? I think that could be helpful. Thank you.
Is that everything from the Travellers Trust, and then I'll deal with all of those points together? Or was there more?
I think we've got to the point where we've sort of exhausted almost the exploration of H5B, unless there's anything else that anything else from your side, first of all. Ms. Cannon.
Forgive my ignorance. I'm new to this element. I was actually saying during the break how scary it is how much of these things go through with no Gypsy traveller representation. It's incredibly scary considering we have a voice here and we're still coming up against this. So forgive my ignorance. But can I just ask a question that's niggling away at the back of my brain? So you have these site allocations with numbers of houses on them that are very clearly set out with streets, I'm guessing, in the planners' minds. They have certain streets and whatever. You're going to squeeze in 6 pitches that have a ground space of around 1.5 acres at least to be adequate. How will that not reduce the number of houses that can be provided by that site? I don't understand how you're going to squeeze these pitches in when they're not already...
If I can help, because I've been dealing with the strategic sites. The sites give an approximate number, but there's no detail as to layout, and they remain flexible. So the details are only determined when they come up for a planning application. So there's nothing, the policy sets the limits on what you can do. So if it requires traveller provision as part of the assessment of the site, that will have to be accommodated by the developer.
Grateful to Mr. Elvin. That leaves, I think, six short points. West of Elvington Lane is simply too late at this hearing to try and pitch for a modification to that policy. In any event, it's not required for soundness. You've heard no argument to that effect. That's the first one. Secondly, concern reiterated about high value windfall sites. To be very clear, those windfall sites in the submission that I made to you, sir, was about the ability for developers to use them to provide alternative permission. It might well be that the Travellers Trust have concerns about an individual Gypsy or traveller household's ability to purchase those sites. That cannot be said of the same of a major volume house builder. If that major volume house builder wants to go for alternative off-site provision, it will be able to afford to do that. The next point was it was alleged that the Travellers Trust had asked us to look at allocations and the City Council had failed to do so. That's not correct, I'm afraid, so I'll give you 2 references. You can look at it, I'm sure, in due course if you need to. The first reference is SD 060. That is an assessment of possible allocations. That needs to be read with SD 018, PDF pages 56 and 187 of that document. What those documents show, firstly, the assessment in SD 60, secondly, why they weren't taking forward SD 18. So it's been looked at, it's been considered, that's in the evidence base as part of the submission of this local plan. No criticism made of either document today. The next point is one of, well, a question of separation. Mr. Elvin's already touched on that. These sites can be and will be master planned appropriately to include Gypsy and traveller provision. All of that can be taken care of through decision making and planning applications in the manner that he's described.
And the appropriateness of the position of the Gypsy and Traveller provision within the master plan will be considered through the planning application?
Correct, sir, yes. And there's no reason in principle why a mixed community cannot be sensitively designed on any of the allocations. And nobody, as we've gone through all of those allocations over the last 3 weeks, has said we can't do it. So I think that really is all I need to say on the points that you've heard there.
Okay, is there anything in relation to policy H5C and that's the sort of criteria-based part of the policy?
Heard my view about that earlier, sir.
Okay.
I think I've addressed that, sir, unless you need me to go back over it.
No, good. Shall we go then to policy H6?
So yes, and I really do hope this one isn't controversial. I talked it through earlier when I introduced both of these policies at the start. I don't propose to do that again unless it assists.
Sorry, no, I rather wish you wouldn't.
No, I won't then.
Is this something that you or one of your colleagues wish to address, Mr. Hargreaves? Ms. Cannon.
It's just to recognise that there's no representation here for from the Showman's Guild. As far as I'm aware, the Showman's Guild were not approached as part of this research. And it's just, yeah, I feel like they've not been given a chance to have a voice.
Well, sir, I don't accept there's been any failure by the council to comply with the 2012 rails or otherwise to publish the plan. I don't think there's any allegation that we've failed to comply with relevant regulations. It's entirely a matter for parties whether they wish to turn up and make representations to you in writing or orally. And if the party hasn't availed itself of that opportunity, there's nothing the council can do about it.
Okay, I don't have any questions on that. Unless there is anything else from anyone, I can adjourn for, I was going to say adjourn, I can actually close this, this phase of hearings. Mr. Hargreaves.
Oh, thank you, sir. It's probably irrelevant, may well be irrelevant now, given that the council appears to be withdrawing the proposed modification to GP4 to allow for affordable exception sites to include Gypsy and Traveller development. I think we regret that as showing maybe a lack of enthusiasm by the council to address the Gypsy and Traveller issue.
Well, I don't mean to cut across, but I really can short-circuit this. It's through no lack of enthusiasm on the part of the council. It's not a policy-based decision on the part of the council. It's simply because to include that would be inconsistent with national policy, and therefore it's not been included. So please don't go into any policy objectives we have.
I understand that, Mr. Henderson, right? But I suppose I'd make the final point that had it been carried through, and I understand the degree of conflict with national policy, it would have provided a possible way forward for some Gypsy and Traveller individual applicants and a possible way forward for H5B housing developers. The fact that has been withdrawn for good reason, confirms confirms my submission that H5B is not going to work, and that is the reality of the situation for the developers.
So
we will. I mean, one thing I would say on that is that we'll be looking at that policy among a whole raft of others in phase, senior moment, phase 4. It feels like it must be a larger number than that, but I'll take your word for it. In phase 4 in September. So I'm going to close then the hearings for phase 3. Maybe take a very short 10-minute break, and then we're going to return here for what I call a wash-up session, which is simply to go through the lists of proposed main modifications and bits and bobs of homework that the council has picked up through this phase, just to check that list is complete, and sort out any queries or whatever as we go along. So that's not a hearing as such, but you are more than welcome to stay and observe if you wish. So then, of course you don't have to. So I'm going to take a 10-minute break, and if you do want to get out of here as swiftly as you possibly can, then you are more than welcome to take that option as well. So I make it 2:38. I'll adjourn the hearing to resume at 2:50. Thank you.